For 18 seasons, Kody Brown talked. He explained his feelings, defended his decisions, narrated his own intentions, gave us speech after speech about love and family and faith, and for all that talking, the audience slowly stopped believing him. Then Christine remarried, and a different kind of man walked into this story, David Woolley. And David did something Kody never figured out how to do in nearly 2 decades on camera. He stayed quiet, and he just showed up. No grand speeches, no defending himself, no making everything about his own feelings. Just a steady, unflashy presence. And the audience fell in love with him almost instantly. So tonight, I want to talk about the loudest thing about David Woolley, which is, paradoxically, his silence, and what that silence reveals about the man he replaced. Let me start with the contrast, because it's the whole story. Kody Brown is a performer. For all his years on television, his instinct in any difficult moment was to talk, to explain, to position himself, to make sure the audience understood his perspective and his pain. His communication was constant, and it was almost always centered on himself. David Woolley is the opposite. He doesn't dominate scenes. He doesn't deliver monologues about his own emotional journey. He shows up, he supports Christine, he's kind to her kids, and he largely lets his actions speak while his mouth stays shut. 2 men, 2 completely opposite approaches to being a husband and a stepfather on camera. And the audience's reaction to each tells you everything about what people actually value. Because here's the thing that has to sting for Kody, if he's paying attention. The man who talked the least won the audience the fastest. David didn't have to make his case. He didn't have to convince anyone he was a good guy. He just was one, visibly, in the small, consistent ways that don't require narration. And the contrast was so stark, so immediate, that fans embraced David almost on sight, while they'd spent years growing more and more skeptical of Kody, despite, or maybe because of, all his explaining. It turns out that the more a man insists on telling you what kind of man he is, the less you tend to believe him. And the less a man says about it, the more his actions get to speak for themselves. Let me unpack why silence reads as strength here. Because it's not silence in a vacuum, it's silence backed by action. David's quiet isn't emptiness. It's the quiet of a man who doesn't feel the need to perform his goodness because he's busy actually being good. When David shows up for Christine, when he's warm to her children, when he handles ordinary life with steadiness and care, he doesn't narrate it. He just does it. And that combination, doing the right thing without announcing it, is the very definition of quiet strength. It says, I don't need credit. I don't need you to understand my perspective. I'm just going to be here and do this. That's a fundamentally secure way to move through the world, and security is magnetic. People trust it instinctively. Now, contrast that with what all of Kody's talking communicated, even when he didn't mean it to. When a person constantly explains themselves, constantly defends their choices, constantly redirects the conversation to their own feelings, it reads, over time, as insecurity, as a need to be understood, to be validated, to be seen as right. Kody's endless narration didn't make him more sympathetic. It made him seem like a man who needed the audience's agreement, who couldn't let an action stand on its own without a speech attached. And the more he talked, the more that need showed. David's silence and Kody's noise aren't just different communication styles. They're windows into 2 different relationships with the self. One man is at peace. The other is forever pleading his case. Let me be fair here, because this channel doesn't do simple hero and villain, and there are real caveats. David has had an enormous structural advantage. He came into Christine's life after the hardest years, after the divorce, with a fresh start and none of the accumulated baggage of a decades-long plural marriage. He gets to be the good guy partly because he wasn't there for the mess. Kody was carrying the weight of an impossibly complicated family structure that no amount of good communication could have made simple. So the comparison isn't entirely fair. David's job, frankly, was easier. He had 1 relationship to nurture, not 4 to balance. We should acknowledge that before we crown him a saint and condemn Kody as a failure. The situations were genuinely different, but here's where I'd push back on my own caveat, because I think the contrast still reveals something true. Yes, David had an easier situation, but the difference isn't only about circumstances. It's about temperament, about how each man handles whatever situation he's in. Even accounting for David's easier road, you can see a genuine difference in how the 2 men carry themselves. David's instinct is to support and stay humble. Kody's instinct, even in his easier moments, was to center himself. So while the structural advantage is real, it doesn't fully explain the contrast. Put David in a hard situation, and I suspect he'd still be the kind of man who shows up quietly. Put Kody in an easy one, and I suspect he'd still find a way to make it about his own feelings. The circumstances shaped the men, but the men also are who they are. Let me talk about what David represents to the audience, because I think he's become something symbolic, almost a corrective. After years of watching a husband who talked too much and delivered too little, the audience was starved for the opposite. David arrived as living proof that the thing Christine, and by extension the audience, had been missing was real and attainable. He's not just Christine's husband, he's the answer to the question the whole show had been implicitly asking. What would it look like to be loved well? David is that answer, walking around, being unremarkable in the most remarkable way. And there's a reason fans find that so satisfying. It validates everything they felt about what Christine deserved and didn't get for all those years. There's a deeper lesson buried in the David Woolley phenomenon, and it's about how we evaluate people in general. We live in a culture that rewards the loud, the self-promoting, the people who narrate their own virtue. But David's appeal is a reminder that real character often shows up quietly, in consistency rather than declaration. The people who actually show up for us in life are usually not the ones giving speeches about how much they care. They're the ones quietly doing the unglamorous work of being present, day after day, without needing applause. David embodies that, and his popularity suggests that, deep down, audiences know the difference. We may be drawn to the loud ones, but we trust the quiet, steady ones. David reminded everyone of that distinction. Let me address something tender here, which is how this comparison must feel for Kody, and whether there's room for any sympathy. Imagine watching the man who married your ex-wife become beloved for doing, quietly, the things you spent 18 seasons failing to convince anyone you were doing. That has to be a uniquely painful mirror. David's silent success is, in a way, the loudest possible critique of Kody's noisy struggle. And while I don't think we need to feel sorry for Kody exactly, I do think there's something genuinely sad in a man being shown so publicly the gap between who he insisted he was and who he actually managed to be. David didn't set out to humiliate Kody. He just lived in a way that, by contrast, exposed everything Kody never managed. Sometimes the harshest judgment isn't an attack. It's just someone else quietly doing it right. I want to be careful not to turn David into a flat, perfect character, because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. We don't actually know David deeply. We see a curated, limited version of him on a TV show. He's surely a real human being with his own flaws and complications that the cameras don't capture. The point of this video isn't that David is a flawless saint. It's that the contrast in how the two men present, the quiet supporter versus the constant self-narrator, reveals something true about character and trust. We should appreciate what David models without pretending we know everything about him. The lesson is in the contrast, not in canonizing a man we only partly know. So here's a question worth sitting with. Why did it take a second husband, an outsider, to show this family and this audience what steady, undramatic love actually looks like? Because that's the real significance of David Woolley. He's not just a nice guy who married Christine. He's a living demonstration of everything the original family was missing, delivered without a single speech. And the fact that he could communicate all of that through quiet consistency, while Kody couldn't communicate it through 18 seasons of talking, is the whole point. Love, it turns out, was never something you could explain your way into. It was something you had to show. David showed it. Kody told us about it. And the audience knew instantly which one was real. So when I step back and look at the David Woolley phenomenon, here's what I see. I see a man whose silence speaks louder than his predecessor's 18 seasons of speech. I see quiet strength, action without narration, security without the need for applause, winning an audience that years of self-explanation never could. I see a genuine structural advantage, yes, but also a real difference in temperament that the advantage doesn't fully explain. And I see, in the contrast between these two men, one of the truest lessons this whole franchise has accidentally taught us, that character is shown, not announced, and that the people who love us best are usually the ones who feel no need to tell us how well they're doing it. David Woolley barely said a word, and somehow, he said everything. Let me talk about the concept of ordinary Tuesdays, because I think it captures David Woolley better than any single dramatic moment could. The grand gestures, the wedding, the big romantic declarations, those are easy in their way. Anyone can rise to a special occasion. What actually builds a life and a marriage is the ordinary Tuesday, the unremarkable day when nothing special is happening and you just show up anyway. Present, kind, steady, and that's where David seems to shine. It's not that he did one enormous thing that won everyone over, it's the accumulation of ordinary days handled well. The quiet reliability of a man who is simply there, consistently, without fanfare. Love isn't built in the highlight reel. It's built in the footage nobody bothers to dramatize. David understood that instinctively, and Cody, for all his talking, never quite seemed to. And the contrast there is brutal when you think about it in terms of time. Cody had thousands of ordinary Tuesdays across all those years and all those relationships, and the accumulated impression the audience formed was of a man who was often emotionally absent, often centering himself, often failing to just be present. David had a fraction of the time and built a far warmer impression because he used the ordinary days well. It's a reminder that presence isn't measured in years. It's measured in how you show up on the unremarkable days. You can be married to someone for decades and never master the ordinary Tuesday. Or you can win a family's trust in a relatively short time by simply being reliably, quietly there. David chose the second path, and it shows. Let me talk about how Christine's kids seem to have responded to him, because that's one of the truest tests of a step-parent, and it matters here. Kids are not easily fooled. They can sense performance, and they can sense sincerity. A stepfather entering a family with this much history could easily have been met with resistance, suspicion, distance. And while I won't pretend to know the private dynamics, the public impression has been of a man who approached Christine's children with warmth and without trying to replace anyone or demand anything. He didn't force a bond. He offered one and let it grow. That patience, that lack of ego about his role, is exactly what allows a blended family to actually blend. David seems to have understood that you earn your place in children's lives slowly, by being safe and consistent, not by announcing that you're now part of the family. Now, I want to dig into the psychology of why we instinctively distrust the over-explainer, because it's the engine underneath this whole comparison. When someone constantly tells you how good their intentions are, how much they care, how misunderstood they are, a part of us tenses up. Why? Because we sense, correctly, that people who are secure in their goodness don't need to keep insisting on it. The constant explaining triggers a quiet alarm. This person is working awfully hard to convince me. And that effort itself becomes the tell. Cody's endless narration, however sincere he may have felt, kept tripping that alarm in the audience. David never tripped it, because he never tried to convince anyone of anything. He just lived it, and the absence of the sales pitch is, paradoxically, the most convincing thing of all. There's a lesson here about how to choose a partner, and honestly, about how to be one that goes way beyond this show. Watch what people do on ordinary days. Notice whether their kindness needs an audience or whether it shows up when no one's keeping score. Be a little wary of the person who's always narrating their own virtue, and pay closer attention to the quiet one who just keeps showing up. David Woolley has become, almost accidentally, a kind of public masterclass in what to look for in a partner. Not the one who gives the best speeches about love, the one who demonstrates it in the small, unglamorous, consistent ways that actually hold a life together. If this whole saga taught the audience one practical thing, it might be that. Trust the doers over the talkers. I think we also have to appreciate what David's presence has given Christine specifically, because that's the heart of why fans love him. For years, the audience watched Christine in a marriage where she often seemed to be giving more than she got, hoping for attention and a devotion that never fully arrived. And then David came along and simply, quietly gave her the things she'd been missing. To watch someone you've rooted for finally be loved well, after watching them go without for so long, is deeply satisfying. David isn't just appealing on his own terms. He's appealing because of what he represents in Christine's story, the proof that she was always worthy of steady, devoted love, and that the lack of it before was never her fault. He's the happy ending the audience desperately wanted for her, and he delivered it without ever asking for the spotlight. And maybe that's the final, quiet genius of David Woolley, that he never seems to want the spotlight at all. In a franchise built on people performing their lives for cameras, here is a man who seems almost indifferent to the performance, content to simply live his life with Christine whether anyone's filming or not. There's an authenticity that the show has rarely seen. Most people on reality television, on some level, play to the camera. David gives the impression of a man who'd be exactly the same with the cameras off. And that, in the end, is the deepest reason the audience trusts him. We sense that what we're seeing is just who he is, not a role he's playing. After 18 seasons of watching a man perform husbandhood, the audience finally got to watch a man simply be a husband. And the difference, it turns out, was everything. It's worth naming the irony at the center of all this, because it's almost too perfect. Sister Wives was, for nearly 2 decades, the story of a man who built an entire identity around being a husband, multiple times over, and who talked endlessly about what that role meant to him. And the most beloved husband the franchise ever produced turned out to be a quiet outsider who married late, said almost nothing about himself, and simply did the job. The show spent 18 seasons studying Kody's loud, theatrical version of being a husband, and the definitive lesson on the subject ended up coming from the man in the background who never asked to teach it. That's the kind of accidental truth reality television occasionally stumbles into. It set out to document one man's idea of devotion and ended up revealing, through sheer contrast, what devotion actually looks like. So I'll turn it over to you, because I really want your take. Do you think David Woolley genuinely embodies a better kind of partner? Or do you think he just had an easier situation than Kody ever did? And here's the bigger question for the comments. What's the David Woolley moment? The small, quiet thing he did that first won you over? Tell me, because I love hearing which specific moments landed for people, and I read every comment. If you want me to do a full breakdown comparing how David and Kody each handle the role of husband and stepfather side by side, let me know and I'll build it. And if you appreciate that we celebrate the quiet good guy while still being honest about the caveats, then do me a favor and subscribe, because that kind of fairness is exactly what we do here, and there's so much more of this story still to tell.